I'm out working at the main 6-acre nursery today, and man, is it hot. It's about around 90 degrees. Been working all morning and thought it'd be nice to take a break from the work and share some notes. I've been walking around as I've been mowing and doing some management and reflecting on those plants which have done incredibly well here despite the fact that we've got a very robust deer population. So in this video, what I want to do is explore plants that after a decade of planting and leaving exposed completely to deer browse have proven to be deer proof or deer resilient. So stick around and let's get into it. I do want to be clear before I start showing these specific plants that I want to acknowledge that what works in our landscape and what has not been compelling to the deer in our landscape may prove in fact to be top tier food for the deer in your landscape. I've definitely learned over the years that different groups of deer have different diets, but I think these are some good foundational plants to consider or at least look into if your landscape is loaded with deer and you don't want to put up fences everywhere. I think if there was just a single fruit-bearing shrub that I would want to call out as just incredibly resilient to deer browse, rabbit browse, to shade, to wet conditions, it would be the black currant in particular. White, red, and pink and Elderberry have very similar characteristics, but the black currant by a long shot has proven to be the least desirable to deer that we have ever seen. Now, that said, in a very brutally cold, dry moment in the winter, we've definitely seen the buds be chewed off. When we get into prolonged drought in the summer, sometimes the deer will eat the leaves in desperation, but it is absolutely not their number one by any stretch food to eat. And when I use the term deer resilient, what I'm referring to is less that the plant will never ever get chewed on by a deer. In other words, I'm not going to say deer proof, but deer resilient means that if it does get chewed on a little bit or even extensively, the plant can rebound quickly. But black currant, if you had one plant to plant in a slightly shaded context without any fencing, without any protection from deer, this would be as close to a surefire thing in the Northeast as I could imagine. Another great winner that has done very well for us is the blackcap raspberry, which is a thorny plant. Whenever you start getting into thorny plants, you're getting closer to a pretty deer resilient plant. There are definitely some exceptions. Black locust, the young growth, is a prize nibble for them. But these plants, again, if they do get nibbled, can keep on growing. But by and large, the blackcap for us does a pretty good job of growing with exposure to deer browse and still being able to most years make a very solid crop. So think about your thorny, suckering, running shrubs and cane fruits as another great candidate for deer resilient long-term planting. A shrub that's proven actually pretty darn deer resilient in our landscape as well has been the elderberry. Now I feel like this is going to be one plant that a lot of people will thoroughly disagree with me on, and I would understand that. Deer definitely like to eat elderberry. I get that. And in fact, we have times where it's pretty hard to get them established, but once they're established, they can outgrow deer browse pretty well. And the fact that you can take cuttings from them in the fall, we find is the best time, and simply stick them in the ground, they do pretty darn well for themselves, even with some deer nibbling here or there. What we found is that if you get extreme browse on one variety or another, we'll simply drop a 2x4 welded wire ring around them for a season, just so they can get some good growth above the deer browse line, and then from there they're off to the races. These plants have been in here for a few years. There's a ton of deer traffic that moves through, and you can see they browse a bit on the lower material, but it doesn't affect the ability for the elder to flower and make fruit at all, and we get tons of cuttings each year. This is a pretty major laneway that deer use to come from across the road and through and into the property. And so definitely needs to be plants that can handle repeated browse quite elegantly that live in this area. So of course we leaned into black currant as a major element along this pathway. And very nice surprise after testing it for a number of years, sea buckthorn or sea berry is really darn tolerant of whatever browse the deer are putting onto these plants. It's minimal enough and the sea berry is growing fast enough that every year these plants are getting bigger and the thickets are expanding. In fact, even with some serious tracks running through in that area, the sea berries in here, this plant went in 2 or 3 years ago. 2 years ago it suckered out to here, so it was all young, luscious growth, which for the most part the deer did not mess with. And now this one is suckering, and there are little sprouts of sea berry all through here. So almost to the point where it could be scary or a nuisance. Sea berry in a landscape that is full sun, with deer moving through extensively, seems to not only be able to establish and grow well, but also expand and colonize in that context. Wow, what a winner. The pawpaw, a Seminole triloba, beautiful understory tree, small tree, large shrub. No, it's a small tree, I guess. Here growing in the understory of black walnut, which is, it seems to be its #1 canopy companion. Pawpaw, for the most part, I don't feel like I've ever seen deer browse on the leaves. In fact, I see almost no browse ever from bugs on the leaves. And I feel like I've heard folks making insecticidal soaps or other deterrents for pests from the leaves of pawpaw. So this is another one where if it did get a little nibble here or there, it should be able to handle that decently. But for the most part, as the deer move through this landscape, the pawpaw is pretty much left alone. And a good example here, there's enough elderberry cuttings. These are 2 years in the ground from sticks. They're going to be huge nursery plants for the fall. Some browse on the sides, but they grow so fast and it's so dense with them that the elders are doing just fine even in this deer channel. So pawpaw and elderberry under black walnut with deer definitely works. Can't wait for the first week of October. Quick side note on the pawpaw and deer. I've seen this now a few times in our landscape, and I'd love to hear if other folks have observed this too. Although deer do not seem to ever be interested in eating the foliage of pawpaw, we have now seen twice where deer have taken established older trees, 6 to 8 year old trees. The bucks love to rub on the stems. And in fact, these shoots that you see, these are all reshoots from where a buck originally had rubbed the main stem, killed the tree, so to speak. It was in the late season. I thought the tree was dead. I cut it down, and then all these new shoots shot up. And so in this case, what I did is I did plop a ring around them just to get them established again. Then I can move that ring later. But if you've got heavy buck pressure in your landscape, you may find that they want to rub the pawpaw trees. Do other folks see that too? The persimmon, American persimmon, been such a nice surprise to see that in general, they can work their way through repeated deer browse and up into the canopy. In fact, here's one that had been chewed back a couple of times, and now this year's got some beautiful vigorous growth. I've read that persimmon leaves have extreme amounts of tannin in them, and I definitely will say I've seen over and over again persimmons chewed on by deer, but once that group of deer tries them, sometimes they'll try them very thoroughly, it seems like they quit trying them. And we've found that over and over again we can pretty reliably plop persimmons into the landscape in random spots, and whatever deer browse does happen, they end up popping through and getting up into the canopy. And once you see a tree like this, where most of the leaves start at around 5 or 6 feet and above, that is a tree that's on its way to being very stable in a long-term successional plan. A little hard to see who I'm even looking at in here, but here are some American plums. These are all valerian flowers that are growing around them. And for being a fruit-bearing tree, found especially the seedling, the more wild sucker and thicket-forming plums seem to do pretty well with deer browse. So like here's one that got hit a bit this spring, but it's sending up new shoots and growing. So overall, pretty reliable. Where I have invested in grafted plums, so for example, over there is a plum I think I paid $25 for. I dropped a ring around it. No big deal. Once in a while, it's not like I'm opposed fundamentally to protecting trees from deer browse, but if I paid money for it, I'd like to protect it. If I've grown them from seed or dug them up from a thicket or a wild stand, I'm happy to experiment. And overall, the wild plums seem to do pretty well with deer browse. I'd love to hear from you folks in the comments below. What are some shrubs and trees that are adapted to the Northeast that you've found that even though you've got large populations of deer moving through your landscape, seem to be able to make a crop and expand and grow each year without much fuss? It's pretty exciting to be able to start cracking that code. I can find scrap fencing here or there, but something, maybe you all know what I'm saying with this, but the act of planting a tree and mulching it and getting it going, really exciting, really compelling. Putting a fence around it somehow is super draining. So when I can find plants that don't need that, I really like those. And so there's a few that I think have done really well for us. Lots more, I can share more in the comments. But let me show now some plants that I would not mess around with. If I had deer, which I do in the landscape, I always put a ring around. If I'm gonna plant a grafted apple or a grafted pear, they definitely get a ring. One thing that you'll see as a theme, I've talked about this before, is because I know how thoroughly uninteresting blackcurrants are to deer, as a rule, I generally plant a blackcurrant next to an apple or a plum every time they go in. It's very easy to add that extra plant, and it seems to add some protection. Here's an Asian pear that definitely gets a fence around it, and you can see some blackcurrants growing really nicely. So even though the fence kind of tapers off at 4 feet here, and by all accounts the deer could reach in and nibble, because there's a blackcurrant on this side, it's invisible to the deer. They're not going to push through the blackcurrant to eat it most of the time. And down below, this horseradish is pretty unexciting to deer. So far, this tree is on its way. And if they eat some of the lower leaves now, that's fine. I'm looking for a taller tree in here anyway. I find if I plant a mulberry and don't put a ring around it, I'm going to lose it. Almost, it feels like the deer would knock me over while I'm planting it in order to eat the leaves. So mulberries always get a ring. And in here you can see I've selected for some blackberries. I pruned out most of the other weeds, so it's a little weedy in here. I'll leave the blackberries, black cap raspberries. We can get some fruit from them, and they'll help form a thicket, a little bit more of a defense than just this fence. Yeah, good move, Sean. A 2-foot tall fence for a mulberry. Worked like a charm. Nope. This mulberry keeps growing. I need to just replace the fence. The mulberry keeps growing, the deer keep eating it back. It's like a all-you-can-eat buffet. And now the grapes are starting to grow up it too. That's on the agenda for today. Let's replace that fence so we can eat some grafted mulberries. We found hazelnut, American hazel in particular, is just about on the top of the list for deer to want to eat. This poor plant just keeps getting chewed over and over and over again. I would venture a guess I put this shrub in the ground in 2011, 2012, and it's still not taller than me because the deer keep eating it. Likewise, one right here, which just now finally is starting to get less and less browse, in part because I stopped pruning the wild roses, which seems to help it. And now it's got one cane that's up and over the deer, so it should be able to start really shooting. On this side, the hazel's got above the deer, I think in part because there's an autumn olive just past them that's providing nitrogen and feed for the hazels and promoting their growth. I think they grew fast enough to get past the deer, and now they're establishing really nicely. This hazel is just a few feet away. Everything is getting chewed that the deer can access. I mean, everything. You basically see here what is the height of an average deer's head that moves through this landscape. It's about 5 feet. I'm gonna wrap it up here. I think I should probably be getting back to work. Sometimes making these videos is an excuse to get out of the sun. But talk amongst yourselves. What are some plants you're finding that are amazing at handling deer browse without much fuss? And what are some abject failures that you thought were not going to get chewed on by deer, but they got decimated? Let's share some notes and see what we can figure out. So deer can move through our landscape, and so can we. We can all eat and not have as much strife in the world. Thanks for watching.